Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and today's video is a conversation with Melissa Landry. Melissa is a registered dietitian. She offers nutritional therapy and body image coaching. She particularly works in the area of generational diet trauma, which is basically, yes, it was all your parents' fault. I kid. But our parents, they grew up in diet culture as well, but those early messages that you get from your caregivers really do leave their mark. Melissa produces some great content on Instagram. Her handle is @NoMoreGuilt. You can go and follow her there. She also has a podcast called Break the Diet Cycle. So if you find what she's saying is resonating with you, you may want to check out her other content. I hope you find the conversation interesting. Hi, Melissa.
Hey, Sarah. Excited to be here.
Thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk to me today. I love this subject because it's one that comes up so often, and I love the way that you talk about it on Instagram and how open you are about your own experiences. That's okay. We can have dogs in. It's absolutely fine.
She does what she wants, so
it's fine. We're all friends here. I'll leave that in. I don't care. So there's a phrase that you use that I think some people would never have heard of, and that is generational dieting trauma. Correct? Did I put that in the right order?
Yeah, that's how I describe it.
I think some people will hear that and go, oh my goodness, it makes sense straight away. And other people will be thinking, what, dieting and trauma? Like, what are we talking about here? Because it sounds quite extreme to call it trauma. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I don't think so. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, I think you're right that sometimes there's that split reaction. And it probably has to do with someone's awareness of their own experience with dieting and how it's impacted them. So someone who maybe is just waking up to the fact that there is a phenomena called the diet cycle that's really well documented, that's not just in individuals, it's in groups of individuals. We see it in research all the time. If you're just waking up to that, yeah, the word trauma is going to feel extreme or perhaps amplified in some way. But if you really are awake to how dieting impacts you, I've been told many times, like, I didn't know that was a thing. The language of that can feel really empowering for people who maybe have been telling themselves for so long, this isn't a big deal, and I shouldn't struggle with these topics of food and body image and family and all the rest. So you're spot on that there are these like two reactions that tend to come up around that term.
Well, I'm seeing so many people dismantling diet culture on social media, but the generational part, that is, it's all your parents' fault, right?
So I see it a slightly different way. So I kind of have this lens that families exist in a society and in a culture. And so diet culture does tell us about some of these bigger and broad forces. And we might think about diet culture of how this shows up, I don't know, maybe in our communities, in the media, expectations and norms, particularly on women. How are we supposed to look and present and be? What is beauty? And that stems back into some even larger forces like patriarchy and racism and all these things that dictate what norms are in our society. But our families live inside that society. And oftentimes the role of the family is to protect the individuals within it. And when that is maybe someone's role, or a parent sees themselves as having that role, they're going to have to learn to navigate this diet culture in a way that protects themselves and their children. And so I don't always see it as like it's mom's or grandmom's fault so much as they're navigating the same culture we're in. And until, I don't know, recently, I want to say with the emergence of like social media, I don't know that we've been having big conversations about what's okay in terms of our relationships with food and bodies the way that we are now. So I look at my mom and her experience, my grandmother and her experience, and I'm like, she had no clue. Maybe there was one friend who read a book about feminism, maybe, and kind of had some, at the time, probably felt like radical ideas about body image and all of this stuff. And if you didn't interact with anyone who challenged it, you would just protect yourself from it and interact with it in a totally different way than if you had the awareness I think a lot of our generation does. So I see it more as like an awakening of generations. And then once you get awake, what do you want to do about it? What do you as a family, and what are you capable of doing to move forward?
Well, on Instagram, you dress up as your mother And you dressed up as your grandmother to
I
create
do.
reels, like highlighting this whole generational dieting trauma. So you clearly got your own experience. And I think that's why your account it spoke to me so much, because I'm just watching those dynamics, watching those scenarios play out. Do you
Yeah.
want to tell us a bit of your own experience, the environment you grew up in, and the impact of your grandmother and your mother on you?
I'll start too by saying the reels are part inspired by real interactions I've had, but also an amalgamation of all the stories I hear through my sessions. So the characters I'm playing are not truly depictions of my mom or my grandmother, as it were.
Good to clarify. You heard it here first, folks.
It's funny because one of my mom's best friends, who I know, like we have relationship, you know, she's like, how do you feel about Melissa making all of these reels of you, Nancy? And she's like, they're not about me, they're about the bigger picture. So we've had lots of conversations about this too, which I can share. But I can tell you a little bit about what it was like for me growing up. So I am the oldest of three girls. And my mom is in a larger body. She always has been. For her, growing up, this meant there was a lot of judgment and criticism about her body. She tells some really sad stories, like, you know, she was chosen to be the lead in her school play in elementary school. And one of the nuns that ran the school said she's too fat for that and removed her from the role because of her size. She has memories of food getting smacked out of her hand or people commenting on her body in ways that were really hurtful for her. So she is someone who, because of her, you know, natural larger body, was prescribed and praised for dieting behaviors from a very young age. And when she engaged in that, that was protective for her. It meant a chance of feeling loved and belonging in my family. It meant, you know, she had more ideas of being attractive and able to meet a partner and have a family, which was her biggest dream in life, was to become a mom. And so dieting meant something to her that is very different what it came to mean to me, being in a smaller body naturally from a young age. So how that played out between my mom and me was that she might really become attached to the fact that me and my sisters were in smaller bodies. I'm so happy you're not fat like me. I'm so happy you got these beautiful thin bodies. And what that impact, I think, on the reverse had on me and my sisters is this over attachment to our appearance as our way of being valuable, loved, and belonging in the world. And what that meant for us was maybe it didn't always play out with food for me the way it can for other people, but it played out around perfectionism, a lot of disconnect between me and my mom, and intimacy and connection between us. There were times when it felt like she really wasn't able to participate because she was so afraid of being seen herself, but she was very proud to have us be seen, like not coming to a field hockey game or something like that. Not being able to make friends with other parents because she felt like she was less than. So my experience with her played out a little bit less around dieting and body image as some of my clients see it, but it absolutely had an impact on the way I saw myself and my value and our relationship with each other. So kind of observing that and becoming a registered dietitian and learning the ways that diets fail so many people, I kind of had this aha moment where I'm like, oh my goodness, it helped me to understand her in a way I really couldn't for a lot of years. So that's sort of how it all played out with us, you know, growing up to today.
I think the most common version of the story that I hear with other people who grow up in an environment where their mother is steeped in diet culture is I hear it coming out as criticism. The people who seem to be really suffering today are those who felt like they didn't come up to scratch of what their mother wanted them to be. And then that's tied in with like worth and all of that. So it's really interesting to hear it the other way around, where the mother's saying, you've got the ideal body and that makes me happy. Like your body makes me happy.
Yeah.
What does that message? Yeah.
Like in the other direction, where I think there's this, it's kind of two sides of the same coin. When we maintain thin privilege, as we're talking about, right? Folks who are in smaller bodies, who are closer to that ideal, do get preferential treatment in our society. Sometimes that's just words. He looks so great. sometimes that's access to seating arrangements or clothing or destigmatized healthcare that exists. And so what I think happens is if you're on the side where you're away from the norm, there's a fear you'll never have the privilege. You're always positioning your whole life, your attitudes, your beliefs, your thoughts, your behaviors to gain that privilege as a way of meeting your needs as a human. And if you have that privilege, you're fearful of anything that's going to move you away from that privilege because you have a sense that if that goes away, like the rest of your value, worth, and belonging. So it's this two ends of the same coin, and it can manifest for different people depending on your disposition. There's other protective factors in our life that can make these things express or not express. But that's how I see it. It definitely gave me that interesting perspective to have my mother's example and my own story and the stories of my clients. It sort of helps me to organize my thoughts around what's going on for people in terms of their relationship to food.
Yeah. How did food show up at home in terms of how did your mother's fears about her own relationship with her body and maybe food as well, I don't know, impact then your experiences of her and how you ate?
Yeah. She was definitely very rigid as a food provider in that we had these really strong set times where it was okay to eat and not okay to eat. And on the one hand, a lot of the parenting advice will say that parents are in control of when their children eat. That's appropriate as a parenting style. Come to find out later now as I'm older. At the time, I don't think that felt harmful because food was always allowed for us. We always had breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner. So there was definitely a little bit of rigidity around the timing of meals. But for her, there was a lot of what I call like environmental restriction. So she would buy just enough, we each had our snack after school. She would buy just enough of the brownies Melissa likes so that there's only 5 for after school. And those 5 are Melissa's, and that way I won't eat one. And then my sister had her. So in terms of the availability of what we might call forbidden foods in the intuitive eating world, there was definitely a restraint around those foods that was different compared for me and my sisters compared to her. And to this day, she still struggles with that, where if we have a party and there's an abundance of desserts, there's almost this like militant, like, I need you guys to take these out of the house because there's a lot of fear of what it's going to mean if there's sweets in the home with just her to negotiate them. She didn't have a lot of opportunity to learn that skill in her early life because of the way she was restricted as a kid.
What do you know about your mum's relationship with her mum growing up? Because your mum's not fitting this ideal, and your grandmother, like you say, it's parents' job to, protect the child, socialize the child, make the child acceptable to society, all these kinds of pressures that are on parents as well. What happened in that dynamic, do you know?
My grandmother is an Italian immigrant. So she moved here to the States when she was, I want to say 19, 20 years old. She had a 3-year-old daughter at the time. And she came here not knowing the language. My grandfather came before her to kind of set them up. And so when I think about my grandmother's story, I also want to add that she grew up in World War II in Italy. So her schooling was interrupted. She was able to go through, I think, the 8th grade. And so a lot of her beliefs and ideas about women and acceptance come from that limited experience that she had, given the social, problems and struggles of the time. So when she came here to the States, I see or interpret her kind of relationship to her body as a way of assimilation. She's 90 years old. She's still with us. She's amazing. If you can kind of distance yourself from the hurt and the problematic, harmful parts of this, it's almost amusing the degree to which she praises her own looks, even still today. She'll say things like, "Oh, Melissa, I had blonde hair and fair blue eyes, and I had a beautiful body, and everyone thought I was so beautiful." Like, she has this deal, and it's like part of me wants that, like, that love for yourself even till you're 90. But it also, to me, expresses the degree to which she valued that. She even today will say, like, I just want everyone to look nice, because to her, looking nice is being safe, and it can show your class. It can show all of these things that she couldn't always show by her education status or her language. She could show by coming in with the right body, the right face, the right hair, the right outfit. She could be accepted. And so I can see how her value for that European thin ideal aesthetic that has come to become, the norms in our society was something she really attached to. And if my mom wasn't that thing, it made her uncomfortable as a mother herself. And the way that she coped with that was by the use of control. So let's try to adjust your diet. Let's try to change the way you eat. And it's unfortunate because that has a real harmful impact, and one I can still see on my mother today. That dynamic is definitely still there between them. And I think it's normalized a lot of times, that, oh, moms are just tough, or they just want what's best for you, or they're just worried about your health. That's not always how it feels when you're on the other side of it. And I saw that through my mom's experience and story.
Yeah. I see so much pain that comes off the back of this, with people really feeling unloved and unlovable because of their parents' disappointment in the way that they looked. I suppose that can intersect, or the way that we might occasionally, often confuse love and approval. But then I hear from some people who say, no, like love was really withheld. It wasn't just approval that was withheld. What are you seeing in terms of the kind of clients that come with this? What are the patterns that you're noticing in terms of how this is affecting, particularly the generation now, the ones that are having a few more of these conversations about diet culture, trying to undo it, trying to be the generation that doesn't pass it on?
Well, I think there's a huge disconnect between head and heart. People talk about this all the time. There's maybe a social justice-y side of them, a very intellectual side that could probably talk about it just like I am. Almost like we're talking about it like we're anthropologists right now. And you can see how Melissa's grandmother, it was World War II and she got on a boat. And we're talking about it from a historical lens, and we're talking about it in a way that I think everyone listening can go, that makes sense. But going through that and the heart hurt that comes from that is a very different thing. And so what a lot of times happens with clients is once they've been able to find language for their experience and click that into if you believe the philosophies and the dynamics I'm describing, if once they can say, oh yeah, that pattern she's describing looks like me, sometimes they can think, well, okay, I've labeled it, so I shouldn't care anymore. I shouldn't care when she makes that comment. I shouldn't care when she says, how was your last PCP, primary care exam? How did that go? I shouldn't care. That's just her, but it still hurts. And it's because there is a very real trauma. There is an open wound or an experience that your now brain can't help but react to because your past brain hasn't resolved just yet. So that's the thing I see happening most often, is that clients don't give themselves the space they're almost like jumping to the end of the movie when they've healed and everything's calm and she's her and I'm me and who cares. If you jump there too fast, you're bypassing some really beautiful, amazing work, which is to figure out who you are, what you care about, what health means to you, what you're feeling in your body. So many of my clients never had that chance to go, I'm full. Because that food was literally slapped out of their hand before they had the chance to know that feeling for themselves. And that's what happened to my mom. So that's maybe the most common pattern I see, is people struggling to move on once they learn maybe the tips and tricks of intuitive eating. They're saying, why can't I apply that? And it's usually because there's some work to do to just make meaning of that past experience in a new way.
So if someone watching this could relate, where might you suggest that they started if they were going to try and do this on their own, if it's possible to do it on your own?
Everything's possible to do on our own. My question is, would you want to? Why would you want to? This can be really lonely work. And sometimes we can't see what we can't see. So if you grow up in an environment where the beliefs, the rules, the attitudes are one way, and you're trying to adopt a new set of beliefs and attitudes, it's not impossible, but it's going to be very hard for you to reference that new set of beliefs against your own as you're going through things that feel very tender and reactive and difficult for you. So, if you're someone who truly is not ready to engage, first of all, I think therapy is critical.
I was thinking more about accessibility as opposed to people just saying, I want to do it on my own. I'm thinking sometimes people just can't.
Yeah, that's true too.
With a professional. Yeah.
That's true too. If therapy is not available and that's not something that you're able to engage with, I do think getting around people who have that language and have that attitude is a really important thing. So I want folks to think about this like learning a new language. You can sit there and do flashcards for Spanish and get as many words as you'd like, but until you're practicing speaking it, it's just a bunch of words. And it's a cool party trick, and that's awesome that you know those words, but you're not able to have a conversation, which is really the beauty of knowing another language. So I would absolutely recommend people take a peek at their social media feeds, particularly if you're a scroller and you know that about yourself. You are literally just reinforcing and absorbing messages that are bringing you back to that old trauma. So that might mean that influencer who maybe is doing workouts on her feed all the time, that just gives you that little tension in your heart every time you see it, that gives you those racing thoughts where you're like, should I do that? I should do that. I used to do that. Why aren't I doing that? If you're noticing those racing thoughts, that might be a sign you need to mute that account and maybe replace it with more positive food and movement accounts. Or my favorite thing, how about no food and movement accounts? It's okay to have other interests and hobbies. My feed is entirely baby seals. Sometimes I like to look at things that are not even about that. That's okay too. So that's one of the ways. You're not a social media person. There are many, many memoirs and books written by folks in all types of bodies that I think are so powerful. When you get that testimony from someone else, if you don't know anybody else in your life that's going through this, you can't say you're the only one. There's at least one person you read their book that went through it. And that can be a really meaningful thing for people to start opening the door and validating their experience.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'm such a big believer in sharing stories. I think that is such a powerful way to reach people, because you can sit there as a nutritionist or a therapist and go, here's 5 tips on how to do this. And people go, oh yeah, maybe those tips are okay, but it's not going to go in. When you hear a story, the thing I love about reading stories, hear people talking about their stories, is there's so much permission to just take the bits that resonate and discard the rest.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're getting advice, like it's jarring to get advice that doesn't resonate.
I know.
But when it's stories, it's like, oh, I resonate with that bit. Oh, I don't resonate with that bit. So yeah, I would say getting your hands on all the stories and just listening to people talking about this, if you can't get the support. And I was thinking about that word trauma, right? So we're talking about trauma. As I'm thinking of it, I'd be interested in how you think of the word, because it's spoken about in so many different ways. Like when trauma is activated, it's a whole embodied experience. And you were talking about people who rationally understand and go, oh, I should be able to do this now. I know what this is.
Yeah.
And then the trigger, I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the word trigger, but it makes sense to some degree. Most of the time we know what we're talking about. That's why I like the trauma word here, because I think it really speaks to how this belief system, this culture is in our nervous systems. Even me, and I'm sure you as well, like the work we do, like it's in there.
Yeah, for sure. And it plays out a lot of different ways for people. But one of the things I talk about with clients is that if you have identified this as your story and you would like a more peaceful experience around food and in your body, intuitive eating is the framework that many registered dietitians are using who do this work. And the whole premise or the basis of intuitive eating hinges on what's called interoceptive awareness. That means your body's ability to sense itself. We have it when we go to the bathroom, you feel that urge to pee. It's time, I go, no questions, because that's not a stigmatized behavior, going pee. But around food, there are a lot of stigmatized behaviors, particularly if you're in a larger body, or if you were conditioned to believe that eating less and moving more is good, and eating more and moving less is bad. And so when you are someone who has those body reactions, your whole body's attention is focused on those reactions, whatever they are for you. They may present differently depending on your experience. But that means that you can't connect with these other signals. They're blunted, they're numbed. Things like our hunger, our fullness, whether food is pleasurable or not, our emotional landscape, which sometimes can dictate our desire to eat food, our distance from our thoughts. Oh, yeah, I'm feeling like I want to rebel from a diet right now. Do I want to pull that thread, or do I want to pause and check in with my body? You can't do that if you are activated or triggered in the moment. So, yeah, that's another important reason to use the word, because I think it gives a little nod back to the body work that is really, really important alongside some of the thinking work like storytelling and reframing your thoughts. There's a real body component to this that probably needs your attention if you relate to diet trauma.
Yeah. And what would you say to somebody who's experiencing a lot of anger about this, who felt really shamed and criticized by a parent and doesn't know how to resolve it, or what to do about that? Whether are we going back and trying to have these conversations? Is it like our work to sort of separate ourselves from? Thoughts?
Well, what an appropriate face she just made. Like, yeah, it's like, ugh, it's yucky. This is really, really hard. And I want to acknowledge that this can feel very sticky and scary and uncertain. And I would invite people to think alongside any emotion you're having. There's probably a lot of fear there too, and that's okay. You are the first in your family to do this work. You literally had no role model. You had nobody to show you how to do this, and you're still doing the work because it's important to you. So one is acknowledging that no matter what you're feeling, including anger, there's probably a lot of fear there too, and that's okay to feel that fear. It's also okay to feel that anger. What you said was like, you're going to that place, like, should I talk to them? Should I not talk to them? Are they dead to me? Or should I fix it? Sometimes when we're in strong emotions, we kind of start to create these binaries, right? I either am away from them and F them and I'm moving on. They blew it as parents on one side. And then the other side is like that fawning response almost. We're like, oh, she didn't know. And she's trying to be a good mom. And I'm going to be the most loving, altruistic person and just let it all go. Those are not the only two options. And you are not obliged to be here or here. You might be here and here sometimes. That's okay. You don't have to be there permanently. So again, part of this body work is starting to recognize, like, yeah, I feel angry. That's valid. Mm-hmm. What does it look like for me to express that anger, to release that anger because it's energy inside my body? You don't have to do anything in terms of your relationship with your parents. And some people do need a significant, what I call like cooling off period, where they're almost more in the quiet, giving themselves space to feel and process those emotions away from the parent who might still be inflicting triggers that bring them up. So that is a really personal decision. Some people are able to maintain relationships with family members stuck in diet culture, and they use it as a way, like as a learning, more of a learning ground, where like, I'm going to interact with them for the express purpose of feeling these things. And as I interact with them, I'm going to learn, and it's going to be rough and it's going to be imperfect, but I am in a place where it feels safe to do that. And some people say, I don't see that as a possibility right now. And one person is not wrong or right in the way that they are processing and deciding what's next for them in their relationships.
What's your relationship to perfectionism these days? Because you're talking about it in a really nuanced way, which is lovely to hear. What's been your journey with that?
Long. Just worth saying. I myself have been in therapy, continued therapy. There's times I take breaks and go back at different milestones in my life. I think that's really common to have an experience where you maybe resolve a trauma response and then something shifts in your life. And again, you've never been there before. Your brain might want to go back to some old patterns. And so one thing that I think is very helpful is learning, and I'm still learning this, is to see that part of you as something that's never going to go away, that is protective, is something that maybe is an asset sometimes, but isn't always. And the best thing you can do is get really good at knowing when it's feeling unhealthy, when it's not an asset, because that's when you can call back your past experiences. So, when I was in my early 20s and that perfectionism happened, I thought I was like righteous and good. Like, I'm like, oh my gosh, you want to be perfect? You can just work hard, white knuckle. And I'd almost cheer myself on through these perfectionist tendencies. And it worked for a little while. Sarah, like when you're in your college years, your early professional years, that attribute is like similar to the fact that when you're dieting and you're white knuckling and your perfectionist tendencies coming around your food, sometimes people are like, what? And it's very hard for you to discern what's working for you and what's not working for you around that dynamic. So how I saw it and dealt with it in my early 20s, now in my mid 30s, is very, very different. And the cool thing now is that I'm faster at noticing when I'm getting in that space. And I'm not at a loss for how to take care of myself through that or what works for me through that. And I can go even deeper and say, okay, when that's happening, that's probably a sign of some sort of unmet need. And what do I got to do to get that need met? And that to me is the boss battle of all this work is starting to see your trauma response as a signal, like, oh, my body's trying to tell me something cool. I'm not afraid of that, versus how it can feel in the beginning when you're just getting awake, which is just like, to me, it feels like someone's taking two cymbals and just banging them in front of my head and I can't think straight. That's what it was like before. So it's changed a lot. And by no means would I say myself or any person has their shit figured out. But that's life. That's the thing you learn to get more comfortable with over time.
Yeah. What I heard, the thread I heard running through that was actually around vulnerability, to be able to admit there are unmet needs, whereas perfectionism is this idea of, I don't have any needs. I can just be perfect and everything will be fine. And then I get to show up in the world much less vulnerable because everyone's going to look at me and go, wow, because it's true up to a point until it's not. Until it's a compulsion.
And it can be scary to have needs. I still feel there's something going on in my life right now. And I thought to myself, oh, I wish I didn't know I felt this way. Now that I've identified that this is my need and this is how I feel, now I freaking gotta tell people and make it happen. Like there's almost like a desire to like, oh boy, because when you don't, after a while, when you've self-silenced for a really long time and you stop doing that, it feels really good. It feels really good to stop self-silencing and to actually go, oh, I need that to the degree I can. How can I deliver on that for myself? It actually can feel worse not to meet your needs once you start to do it, which is a good thing too. It sort of helps that inner feedback loop for you. So yeah, it can be really uncomfortable, especially if you're used to going with the flow. And this comes back to families, Sarah. It's a system. And if your role in the family was, mom prescribes diet and I do it with her and we diet together and we bond and my mom really likes me. And the first time you say, I don't want to do that, terrifying. It's so scary. It can be really scary. It can be scary even thinking about telling someone you're not trying to lose weight anymore.
Yeah.
Because you can't control what they're going to think or feel about that. So
a question I get asked a lot, and I'm guessing it's something you come across all the time, is people will ask me, how do I put in boundaries with family members who are still very much in dieting? And again, it comes back to that. I know it's two ends of the spectrum. Like one, I need these boundaries and you must respect my boundaries. And two, this is all my stuff and I should just figure out how to handle it, and everything in between. Yeah. But I suppose I wondered your thoughts on putting those boundaries in with family members and what your thoughts are around boundaries and that aspect in general.
I think it's so personal. I get a little, I'm like kind of twofold here. Part of me is so grateful for social media and all of the mental health education that you can receive, like talking about accessibility. It's such an asset to get conversations. It's normalized. The idea of boundaries is normalized a little bit more, I think, than maybe 30 years ago. I don't know that was in the vernacular of I don't know, I wasn't there, but it doesn't seem to me, based on watching the generation above us, that boundaries was as accepted and normalized as it is today. But for my perfectionist brain, sometimes when I see modeling of boundaries, you can get attached, like that's the right answer. If you feel activated, you say this, then they do this. And if they don't do this, they're bad, I'm good, I'm good, they're bad. And sometimes if you don't have space to be more flexible around the boundary setting experience, sometimes I worry that it actually does more harm than good, because what it does is it creates disconnection from your body, because you're creating this like castle of like, this is what's going to happen. And we put all of our energy into that dynamic that we're not actually attending to our own needs. So, for example, let's say somebody, like the holidays are coming up. We have our Christmas holiday, Hanukkah's happening right now, New Year's coming up. I've had clients say, well, I'm going to go in and I'm going to tell my mom right when I walk in, do not comment on my body. And they haven't really thought through past that point. And because of that, there is an even higher degree of uncertainty than if they said nothing. Because if they said nothing, they know exactly how mom's going to act. Mm-hmm. But when they walk into the room, now the guard is up even harder. There's even more distress because there wasn't maybe a readiness or a completeness around the boundary setting technique. They only learned to say it. They didn't learn how to negotiate it. What are they going to do to enforce it, et cetera. So one thing I encourage clients to do is to think about maybe two sides of what's going on for them. One is, what do they need to feel safe in their body, say at the Christmas party? That's a very different thing than what they need from their relationship in front with their parent. Mm-hmm. What can happen is sometimes when we set a boundary, we say, do not comment on my body. And if she does this part, the relationship is over. And those are two separate things. And so sometimes I like to help clients think a little bit about like, what does repair and safety look like in your relationship versus what does safety look like at the party? What is the objective at the party for you so that this doesn't become so high stakes and people can actually think through it in a little bit less extreme or calm way? Now, for some clients, they say, oh, well, if I'm thinking of this clearly, like I actually don't care if she comments on my plate, but if she comments on my body, that's a problem. So even just that distinction can help people to be more clear, to think through what they would do if that boundary was breached in any way. I think it's really all about breaking this down as small as possible, particularly if you've never really done this before. Thinking about ways to maintain your safety through the process is an important one. Otherwise, you might accidentally make more distress than you intended. So it's a process.
Yeah. That word safety, I just want to highlight again. I think when we're talking about trauma, there is something about trying to make ourselves safe. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes people feel guilty that they need safety. Like it should be okay. What's not safe, Yeah. And I wanted to mention it because I wanted to honor that experience, really, of how unsafe this really can feel. And
it's your food. It's a basic need. I know we normalize this dieting stuff. And I think there's also this individualism, like almost like a toughen up attitude. No, it's food. Your body sees food. I mean, it sees air maybe a little bit more urgent and immediate, but it's on the list. Air, water, food. Your brain is hardwired to be very protective of those three things, first and foremost. Yeah. When you're deprived of those things, you don't survive. And so if someone is making you feel threatened in that I want to eat more, but I can't because of judgment or punishment or whatever, that is unsafe. It's true. It is an unsafe, at least to your body. Yeah. Your body perceives that as unsafe.
Yeah. But even the relationship, right? The relationship with a parent is so tied in with survival as well. Yeah. That threat of that, the withdrawal of approval or apparent withdrawal of love, can feel threatening to our very survival.
It's deep triggering.
Isn't it just
feelings? Yeah, for sure.
These relationships. I mean, my dad can just raise his voice a little bit and my whole body will react in a way that I don't with anybody else. People can shout or get mad around me and that's fine. But it's like my nervous system is trained to respond in a very different way when it's coming from him.
Yeah, it's totally different.
But yeah.
And to that point. Like, if you're saying, it doesn't feel safe to set a boundary, I don't know if you'd agree. This might be an unpopular opinion. I think that's okay. I think sometimes there's a lot of shame, again, with that awareness. Like when you recognize maybe injustice within your family toward you, and you don't feel ready to address or correct that injustice in some way, there can be a lot of shame. Like, why wouldn't I do that? There's a lot of negative self-talk around that. And sometimes for my clients, what it looks like is like, I'm not ready to say anything or be different in the party. I'm going to just go. But knowing that, I'm going to do my best to invite breaks. I'm going to go to the bathroom and wash my hands with cold water. I'm going to set a plan immediately after. So I have to leave after 2 hours. I'm not going to be sitting in that for 8 hours like I usually do. I'm going to make sure that the very next day I have a coffee date with my best friend who always makes me feel safe. You can actually invite these containers. If you know you're very likely to be activated, you can invite your self-care containers around that. Maybe that's socialization. Maybe that's like some alone time. Maybe that's listening to Adele and having a good cry. Like whatever it is for you, sometimes those can be intermediate actions you can take while you process and prepare for future boundary setting. So I just like to tell that to people, like it's not over because you couldn't do it the first time you thought of it. Sometimes it takes time to feel safe to take these steps and change your relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Melissa, thank you so much. That's just absolutely flown by that time. Thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your experience. And I mean, I put all the details below about how to contact you, but you're No More Guilt on Instagram. And I'll put your website and everything else below so that people can get in touch and follow your content. So thank you so much for your time.
Sarah, I appreciate what you do. It was really nice to talk today.